Behavioralism reveals the impact of surroundings on living creatures in the way they perceive their multidimensional environment by inheriting certain spatial decision-making mechanism as they portray their conceived understanding. Professor Carl Sauer's cultural determinism stressed the cultural surroundings' significance over human interactional behavior. Professor John Kirtland Wright emphasized the imaginative curiosity in developing perceptual environment and introduced geosophy for studying geography regarding any kind of view. The cognitive processes are behavioral environmental perception that Professor F.P. Gulliver explained as direction finding through maps in 1907, which later being recognized by physicist Professor C C Trowbridge's egocentric orientational reference system for location spotting during 1913. Professor William Kirk in 1952 developed a Gestalt theory-based understanding model that accounted perceived surroundings for behavior synthesis rather than objective environment. Professor Kenneth Boulding in 1956 portrayed that human knowledge about surroundings evolved as an image, which being further illustrated by architect Professor Kevin Lynch in his book, The Image of the City. The surroundings understanding bearing mental map consists of 5 repetitive characteristics of all around places, that are paths, nodes, edges, landmarks, and districts. Professor David Lowenthal in 1961 introduced influential work, Geography, Experience and Imagination collaborated environmental psychology with geographic fieldwork behavioral genesis being motivated by Professor J K Wright's notion that people used to reside in narrowed provincial parochial worlds of cultural conservative custom guidance accompanied by some sorts of choice-based acceptance from the outer realms. Professor Peter Gould simulated African foreigners' uncertain cultivational traits through game theory motivation in 1963, which modified the spatial analysis view regarding farming know-how and possible rational economic opportunities. Professor Julian Wolpert in 1964 carried out a Swedish farming decision-making analysis for potential yields that shown Professor Simon coined satisficing behavior. Professor Thomas Saarinen used Thematic Apperception Test in 1966 for drought-prone Great Plains analysis, recognized experience-based biased perception behavior. Professor Allan Pred industrial locational analysis in 1967 to convey dissatisficing behavior. In 1971, Professor Brian Goodey demonstrated perception of the environment in his egocentric spatial hierarchy of perceived spaces. The hierarchical core consisted of personal space as well as intimately familiar places. Thereafter, persistent visiting places of varying frequency up to distant places.Far places recognition could be based on externally notified different feedbacks, and spatial distance might be fabricated personally. Professor J R Gould in 1980 introduced an introduction to behavioral geography that included a schematic framework for individual spatial cognition and behavior. The images and spatial schemator are cognitive behavioral mediators. The images are symbolic mental perceptual thought-based fabrication gained through prolonged observations. These images are remembrance of the surroundings whenever direct sensory observations are being recalled. The spatial schemator are frameworks within which one could assemble his understanding of surroundings consisting of both past and present informational experiences. The personal traits, surroundings customs as well as cognitive processes determine these images and spatial schemator. The information and decision filter inputs affect the information outputs. The feedback loops generate impulse at different categories to signify perception learning, ascertain meanings for understanding for future behavioral mending tactics.